This is Library Pizza, a podcast about reading. When I think about my goals for this podcast, definitely one of them is that you enjoy listening to it. But that's not the only goal. Mainly, honestly, my hope is that every week when you see the podcast art that Blorb so kindly made for me pop up toward the top of your little podcast app to let you know that there's a new episode, it will serve as a reminder that reading is a good thing to do with your time, that you enjoyed it the last time you did it, and that if it's been a little while, you should spend some time reading again. Honestly, that's really the main thing I want to do here. Unfortunately, this week, my scheduled interview guest fell through, so I decided to do something a little bit different. Rather than scramble to find a new person to interview and edit in a really unreasonably short amount of time, I decided to do a version of a thing that I've been planning already. So what I've been wanting to do is to occasionally have an episode where I bring back people who have been on the show and we all just read to each other from different things that we've talked about in previous episodes, things that we're reading now, stuff like that. Since I didn't have time to organize that for this episode, I thought I would just read from several things to you myself. If that's not what you're here for, I don't blame you. I'll tell you that I read excerpts from 3 things in this episode. The first is an excerpt from a story by Spider Robinson, and then the second and third are excerpts from novels by Magda Szabó. I think I get better as I go. I've already recorded these, and so I'll put time codes in the show notes in case you want to skip around and listen to only parts of them. I've got comments that I made on a couple of the pieces, and then the last piece is it's so good, I just didn't feel like I had anything to say about it yet. I might after I finish reading that book, but for now I just wanted to give you that first chapter and let you decide if you would like to read the rest of the book, which I do strongly recommend. So again, no worries if that's not what you're looking for from this show. Next week should be a return to form. But if you do enjoy listening to it, I hope you'll let me know. Honestly, it would be convenient if people did like these and I could occasionally just mix in an episode where I don't need to schedule with anybody else. So if you loved it, I would be happy for multiple reasons. Regardless, thanks for your time. I hope that you read something fun this week, and I will see you next week. The first reading will begin after my incredibly dignified theme music.
Library Pizza! P-I-Z-Z-A! Library Pizza! P-I-Z-Z-A!
This is a selection from The Guy with the Eyes by Spider Robinson. Callahan's place was pretty lively that night. Talk fought Budweiser for mouth space all over the joint, and the beer nut supply was critical. But this guy managed to keep himself in a corner without being noticed for nearly an hour. I only spotted him myself a few minutes before all the action started, and I make a point of studying everybody at Callahan's place. First thing, I saw those eyes. You get used to some haunted eyes in Callahan's, the newcomers have them, but these reminded me of a guy I knew once in Topeka who got 4 people with an antique revolver before they cut him down. I hoped like hell he'd visit the fireplace before he left. If you've never been to Callahan's place, God's pity on you. Seek it in the wilds of Suffolk County, but look not for neon. A simple, hand-lettered sign illuminated by a single floodlight and a heavy oaken door split in the center by the head of one Big Beef McCaffrey in 1947 and poorly repaired. Inside, several heresies. First, the light is about as bright as you keep your living room. Callahan maintains that people who like to drink in caves are unstable. Second, there's a flat rate. Every drink in the house is $1 with the option. The option operates as follows. You place a $1 bill on the bar. If all you have on you is a fin, you trot across the street to the all-night deli, get change, come back, and put a $1 bill on the bar. Callahan maintains that nobody in his right mind would counterfeit $1 bills. Most of us figure he just likes to rub fistfuls of them across his face after closing. You are served your poison of choice. You inhale this and confront the option. You may, as you leave, pick up 2 quarters from the always full cigar box at the end of the bar and exit into the night. Or you may, upon finishing your drink, stride up to the chalk line in the middle of the room, announce a toast, this is mandatory, and hurl your glass into the huge old-fashioned fireplace which takes up most of the back wall. You then depart without visiting the cigar box, or pony up another buck and exercise your option again. Callahan seldom has to replenish the cigar box. He orders glasses in such quantities that they cost him next to nothing, and he sweeps out the fireplace himself every morning. Another heresy: no one watches you with accusing eyes to make sure you take no more quarters than you have coming to you. If Callahan ever happens to catch someone cheating him, he personally ejects them forever. Sometimes he doesn't open the door first. The last time he had to eject someone was in 1947, a gentleman named Big Beef McCaffrey. Not too surprisingly, it's a damned interesting place to be. It's the kind of place you hear about only if you need to, and if you are very lucky. Because if a patron, having proposed his toast and smithereened his glass, feels like talking about the nature of his troubles, he receives the instant, undivided attention of everyone in the room. That's why the toast is obligatory. Many a man with a hurt locked inside finds in the act of naming his hurt for the toast that he wants very much to talk about it. Callahan is one smart hombre. On the other hand, even the most tantalizingly cryptic toast will bring no prying inquiries if the guy displays no desire to uncork. Anyone attempting to flout this custom is promptly blackjacked by Fast Eddie the piano player and dumped in the alley. But somehow many do feel like spilling it in a place like Callahan's, and you can get a deeper insight into human nature in a week there than in 10 years anywhere else I know. You can also quite likely find solace for most any kind of trouble from Callahan himself, if no one else. It's a rare hurt that can stand under the advice, help, and sympathy generated by upwards of 30 people that care. Callahan loses a lot of his regulars. After they've been coming around long enough, they find they don't need to drink anymore. It's that kind of bar. I don't want you to get a picture of Callahan's place as an agonized Alcoholics Anonymous type of group encounter session with Callahan as some sort of salty psychoanalyst father figure in the foreground. Hell, many's the toast provokes roars of laughter, or a shouted chorus of agreement, or a unanimous blitz of glasses from all over the room when the night is particularly spirited. Callahan is tolerant of Ranny Gazoo. I don't know what... I'm going to pause here to tell you, the word that is on the page is definitely Ranny Gazoo. There's no other way to pronounce it. I have never encountered this word before. RANNYGAZOO. He maintains that a bar should be merry, so long as no bones are broken unintentionally. I mind the time he helped Spud Flynn set fire to a seat cushion to settle a bet on which way the draft was coming. Callahan exudes, at all times, a kind of monolithic calm, and US 40 is shorter than his temper. This night I'm telling you about, for instance, was nothing if not merry. When I pulled in around 10 o'clock, there was an unholy shambles of a square dance going on in the middle of the floor. I laid $1 on the bar, collected a glass of Tullamore Dew and a hello grin from Callahan, and settled back in a tall chair to observe the goings-on. That's what I mean about Callahan's place. Most bars, men only dance if there's ladies around, of one sex or another. I picked some familiar faces out of the maelstrom of madmen weaving and lurching over honest-to-God sawdust and waved a few greetings. There was Tom Flannery, who at that time had 8 months to live and knew it. He laughed a lot at Callahan's place. There was Slippery Joe Mazer, who had 2 wives, and Marty Mathias, who didn't gamble anymore, and Noah Gonzalez, who worked on Suffolk County's bomb squad. Calling for the square dance while performing a creditable Irish jig was Doc Webster, fat and jovial as the day he pumped the pills out of my stomach and ordered me to Callahan's. See, I used to have a wife and daughter before I decided to install my own brakes. I saved $30 easy. I'll stop reading there. I chose to read this because, honestly, because in my conversation with Ed in the last episode, I was really interested when he described Spider Robinson. I actually remember there's a video game based on this world, on this series of short stories, Callahan's Cross Time Saloon. I don't know what the game is called, but maybe it's called Callahan's Cross Time Saloon. I didn't think to look it up. But I'd heard about the adventure game a while ago, and I thought it was really interesting. And when Ed reminded me that it existed and that this series of stories existed, I thought, okay, I want to go check that out. So I've been reading it a little bit at a time here and there, and I'll say it's a really easy read. The prose has a style to it that feels a little bit affected to me, where it's both like very brisk and it will kind of randomly dip into like one or two carefully selected like kind of anachronistic bits of flavor. There are sentences that are written, I have to assume, in imitation of other writers or something like that, because they kind of stick out. And like in some cases, I'm not even totally sure what they mean. But at the same time, there is something really pleasant and personable about the approach. Reading that sample, I feel like the slightest bit of frustration because I feel like he is summarizing for me what it's like to be in this place more than he is necessarily bringing me into the experience myself. And there's practical reasons for that. This is a short story and it doesn't have a lot of time to do the things that it's trying to do. And it's introducing a world, it's introducing a cast of characters. And on top of that, it's bringing you into a very different sort of vibe from what the readers at the time would have been expecting. So Ed talked about this a little bit. There's an introduction by Ben Bova to the collection that I'm reading this from, where he talks about how Spider Robinson was an unusual guy, and he was especially unusual for the kind of writer that they tended to publish in the science fiction magazines of the time, and his subject matter was unconventional in a way that now feels, I think, like extremely vanilla. Like I would be kind of amazed to find the science fiction publication still standing today that doesn't have enough flexibility to allow this kind of thing to be in it. There's an alien in this one who, if the wrong thing happens, he's going to cause the whole world to explode. So, I mean, to me, that's like classic science fiction stuff, right? But at the time, the fact that it spent any time at all in this kind of, I don't want to say vanilla, because this is also like an unusual sort of vision of masculinity to an extent for its moment, but it is not what the readers expected. And it is very explicitly describing, here's the vibe that you're getting instead of the thing that you might have thought you were getting. And it's a nice vibe, and it's a pleasant vibe, and it's a friendly vibe. It's welcoming, and you are invited to imagine yourself in this setting. And as the story goes on, we get a little bit more sort of, blow by blow in-scene description that lets us get in there a little bit more vividly, lets us feel like we're part of the action, that we are experiencing it in real time with the characters. But initially, we go through this period of, again, what I would call summary, which is, for me, not as arresting as something that lets me experience the world in a way that, like, obviously it's not unmediated. It's fictional, so there's a mediation between you and nothing, and the mediation is actually all you get, right? There's no fantastic world behind the writing. There's the writing, which makes you feel like you have access to the fantastic world that does not actually, in fact, exist. But it is my personal taste that I be either given more direct access to that through descriptions of kind of the sensory experience of being in the fictional space, or you actually like draw more attention to the artificiality of the situation and play a little bit more with the language in ways that maybe serve to stand between you and the fictional world, but provide a lot of linguistic beauty sentence by sentence, right? This is kind of a weird compromise, and it's not my favorite compromise, but I do like it, and it's an interesting style, and I've been enjoying reading it. Transition sounds. Whoosh. I'm going to read a selection from The Fawn by Magda Szabó as translated by Lynn Ricks. You really would have loved my father. I've never talked about him much. If I haven't done so, it's because I never say much about anything. Not about you or anyone else. As a child, I was so quiet, I never learned to talk very well. What it says on my CV is a pack of lies. The things people say about me are all lies. I lie so easily, I could have made a career out of it. I have come to realize that if I can't bear to speak the truth even to you, then I am beyond all help. But it is true, for example, that he would have chatted to the beetle and told him, "Go in peace, little traveler," and then he would have squatted down next to him to say the words. It's interesting. Whenever I think about him, I always see him squatting down like that, with his thin gray hair tousled over the dome of his beautifully formed forehead, gazing from behind his glasses at some insect or flower. I see a kind of dew on his brow, Not horrible and sweaty, more like condensed steam, like when you breathe warm air onto a glass and it stays there for a while. When he died, the moisture was still on his skin. I wiped it off with the palm of my hand. I had washed the handkerchiefs the night before, but they were still damp. It was winter, and the wet washing was hanging in the attic and making cracking noises when it moved. All our best handkerchiefs came to us from Auntie Irma. Later, I dried them over a coal fire for Mother to wipe her tears on. I've never told you about Auntie Irma, and yet I wore her shoes for 2 whole years. Have you ever noticed how whenever we're bathing somewhere, when I get out of the water, I always put my sand shoes on straight away? I put my left foot on the pier and quickly bury the right one in the sandal. At Solnock, when we went up to our room and you came in to join me, I wasn't sitting normally on the bed with my legs stretched out. I was squatting on my heels. When you left me early next morning, you laughed and said I was such a prude because when you switched the light on to pick up your watch and your wallet, I pulled the bed cover over and hid my foot under it. Pippi will have told you that I am certainly no prude. When the weather's warm, I am perfectly happy to go about undressed. But Pippi also knows that I have 2 large corns on my right foot and they never go away, even when I have shoes specially made. You were so cross when I wouldn't let you come with me to the shoemaker to try on the red ones with straps. I didn't want you to see my right foot, and I didn't want to tell you about Auntie Irma. Yesterday it was my right foot that was swollen. I was wearing slippers when I showed it to Eureka. Today I'm wearing Gizzy's shoes, and it hurts every bit as much as it did when I was growing up in the ones I had from Auntie Irma. Her feet were as small as a child's, and she took a childlike pride in their being so incredibly tiny. One summer when I was at secondary school, my foot burst out of one I was wearing. That evening, I went to see Embrus, the bootmaker, to ask him for some thread to sew them up. He gave me the thread but wouldn't let me do it. He sewed the soles to the uppers himself. "What do I owe you?" I asked him, and he said I should feed the pigs. So I dragged the swill out for the 2 great brutes and nearly broke my back lifting it over the fence. If I had gone inside and stood at the trough, they would have knocked me onto the ground. I also had to sew a tear in his blue trousers, the ones he wears to the orchard on Sundays, and only then were we quits. I still thought he had put me to a great deal of work for a stupid bit of thread. When I got home, I was still barefoot, carrying the shoes in my hand. Father was in the garden. "We must get her some shoes," he said, and Mother sighed. That's true. I just went into the kitchen to see what there was for supper. "We should get her some shoes." Well, of course we should. But I finished the school year just as I was, still no shoes. That evening, Auntie Irma called round. Father was already in bed, so Mother took out the cherry wine that he wasn't allowed to drink. She didn't drink it either. She just made a show of doing so, and when the guest had left, she carefully poured the untouched contents of the glass back into the silver-plated carafe, drop by drop. Auntie Irma was very fond of me. She would hug me and stroke me and give me lumps of sugar. I put up with the caresses like a little whore, watching her to see if she was going to give me money. She didn't often do that, almost never in fact, but she almost always gave me presents. That evening, it was a coral necklace because I was a big girl now, a pupil at the gymnasium, and she hung it around my neck with a kiss. I stared at her in amazement. If we sold it to the jeweler, he might put it on his window and she would know. Clear coral. I didn't even have a decent skirt. I slid down out of her embrace. I could no longer bear her petting and her intimacy. I was still standing beside the table in my pinafore with pig swill smeared on the hem, my toes sticking out of the front of my shoes, and this coral necklace glowing around my neck. Irma looked me up and down, then asked what I would be wearing to the school start of term ceremony. Mother gave another sigh. The school specified 3 sorts of uniform, and I didn't have a single one of them. She avoided answering. She just stammered out something. Auntie Irma's stupid little eyes brightened with pleasure. She stretched out her foot, compared it with my bare one, and then pulled off her shoes behind the tasseled tablecloth and tried on one of mine. It was slightly too big for her, and she was filled with pride and joy. She asked Mother not to be offended because they were relatives, first cousins in fact, and she loved me like her own child, but since we happened to be so very similar in the size of our feet, she would like to send me some of her shoes to wear at the ceremony. She got bored with them very quickly. She was forever buying new ones, and the old ones were left to dry out in the wardrobe. I looked at her feet. She was wearing beautiful yellow shoes with slightly raised heels. They were very small and very showy, like toy shoes. Mother lowered her eyes and looked away. The next day I received a pair of black ones. They had buckskin insoles and were done up with buttons on one side. I wore a plain white dress to the ceremony. It was a windy, rainy September afternoon. The rest of the class were in their regulation dark blue uniforms, buttoned up to the neck, and even then some of them were cold. I was well hardened, like a little bear, but on the way to the church I felt thoroughly fed up, limping along in my horrible buttoned-up shoes. My form mistress called me to one side. She had a message for my mother. She should buy me a pair of proper girls' shoes and not this flashy sort designed for grown-ups. I asked her if the school was prepared to provide me with a pair, so she asked me my name, and when I didn't answer, she turned bright red and dropped the subject. The school had been founded by my great-grandfather. It's named after him, Moses Engsi Gymnasium. I went there on a scholarship in my side-button shoes. After a year, it became apparent that Auntie Irma's right foot was half a size smaller than her left. At the start, it had simply hurt when I walked in them. After a while, I could only hobble along and then not even manage that. Mother was in tears every evening when I washed them, and she saw my toes growing twisted and swollen. By then I had 4 pairs of the shoes, each one smaller than the last. When my aunt died, my first feeling was one of relief that she would be sending me no more of them. Mother had always believed that she would leave everything to me, the apartment, the furniture, and her clothes, but she died without making a will, and her younger brother packed it all up and cut us out completely. The next day, I went back to Ambrose and got him to cut the fronts off. Open-fronted shoes were not in fashion at the time. Father went white when I arrived home in these butchered ones with my toes poking out in my torn stockings. I carried on wearing them to school for a while. Then the form mistress bought a pair with money from some religious foundation and showed them to me after school. I kissed her hand and asked what I should do in return. From then on, I was allowed to go to the boarding school and help the third years memorize their lessons. Again, that was from the Fawn, which I feel like I've been talking about since like the second episode of this podcast, maybe the third. I have been in such a Magda Szabó phase ever since Tracy read The Door and reminded me how much I loved it. I've decided since finishing this one, which I did a couple weeks ago now, that I'm going to read everything she's written that's been translated into English. I loved everything I've read so far. I do think The Fawn, for me, has been probably my least favorite. I mean, so Abigail is, I talked about that one a little bit with Ned a couple weeks ago. It is a book that is really for children and does feel like a YA novel. It has a lot of complexity in some ways, and then in other ways it's fairly moralizing and didactic, and that can be a little challenging for me as a relatively mature adult to really enjoy. But it is, I think, obviously very well crafted. It's considered a classic, and I think with good reason, and I think a lot of people get a lot out of it. And The Fawn is also quite beautiful in many ways, and it is very well crafted, but I don't think that it's quite as complete of a project. And for me, the biggest issue with it, I've alluded to it a few times in my conversations with folks as I've been working my way through it. I find it unnecessarily slippery in not so much its individual moments, although some of those do end up getting a little bit lost in the fog too, if you're not like really doing a good job of keeping track of the time and the characters and their relationships to each other. But the overall arc of it can be difficult to perceive until you reach the end. You may remember there was a moment where I was like convinced that the main character had murdered the character to which the book is addressed. There is a you in this book that is written. The book is essentially written as a letter to them, and the you turns out to be a lover with whom the protagonist is having an affair. Or rather, I suppose he's having an affair with her as he is married. I was convinced that there was some sort of a twist coming in terms of their relationship to each other above and beyond the revelation that it was an affair, because initially that was not clear, at least to me. And there isn't. Not to spoil the book, but she does not, as far as I can tell, murder him, and is quite sad to see him gone. And when I got to those last, 30 pages or so, it kind of, once I became clear on what the book actually had been about, what it had been building to, and where it was going now in its final chapters, I felt like it really, clicked into another gear and took off and started to, it just really blew me away in the way that her work does when it is at its best. So I have no regrets about reading the book. I think it was great. And now I'm reading another book by her, which I'm going to also read a little bit from, just to make sure that you have every opportunity to get as Magda Szabó pilled as I am. But I think that this part that I've read illustrates where I find a lot of her, where I think she's strongest. So we start out with an introduction to the overall sort of dramatic situation. We're going to gradually put together that the person that she is writing this letter to is dead, that they're having the affair, as I mentioned, that they have this kind of tumultuous history, and they were going through some really challenging and frustrating moments and conversations together. And then he suddenly, unexpectedly, violently died. And that is all kind of encoded in the introduction before the bit that I read to you. But it's not explicit. It's not totally clear. At least it wasn't to me on first reading. I am kind of curious if it would all be a lot more obvious to me on return. But the point being, that stuff is all a little bit abstract. It's all a little bit slippery. But then we really snap into focus when she starts to introduce us to herself as a child, which is where a lot of the narrative actually takes place, is with her as a young person, as an adolescent. And what's so beautiful to me about this selection is, and I talked about this in my conversation with Allie, Ann, and Leah from Tunnel Talk, she could just say, I was very poor growing up. And that would communicate the fact of the situation. But instead, what she chooses to do is focus in on one really specific aspect of that poverty, which is, I didn't have shoes that fit me well. I didn't go into it in this selection, but there's basically the protagonist is the daughter of a very downwardly mobile man who theoretically could have been fairly well off himself. And between his life choices and his illness, that doesn't happen. So she has these connections that get her things like these nice shoes. But the problem is that the nice shoes do not actually fit her. They are subtly miserable. There's almost a rebuke of her childish femininity in the fact that this rich aunt is, she's got these dainty little feet that she's so proud of. And the protagonist, who is actually a little girl, doesn't have feet quite small enough to benefit from them. And there is the description of just the physical misery of wearing shoes that fit poorly as a child as your feet are growing. And for me, the whole arc of this section illustrates what it feels like to be poor, what it feels like to be in connection with other people at various socioeconomic levels, people with different access to different kinds of resources, and how you are forced to, she describes herself as behaving as a child like a whore, is her phrasing, in that she is putting up with physical affection in order to see if she can get something out of this relative, right? She's thinking, are you going to give me something in exchange for these snuggles? And I find the dynamics there so real, so beautifully rendered, and so evocative of a whole life that it feels like the story of these shoes and of the work that she did to repair them and to, repair her previous shoes, and the way that she trades labor, like feeding pigs and mending pants, in order to get help from the shoemaker. That stuff is all like really perfectly executed to me. And this is a good example of it's not that we are richly in scene with a ton of sensory detail in each of these paragraphs, pretty far from in some cases, but everything is structured in such a way that I really feel myself in each of those moments, right? The prose is, I was thinking about this earlier, how to characterize Szabó's prose, which I think is really lovely, but doesn't draw a ton of attention to itself most of the time. And I think I would say that it is clean, but not austere. It doesn't, like I said, it doesn't draw a lot of attention to itself. There isn't a lot of heat coming off it. There isn't a lot of demand that you pay attention to the sentences, but the sentences are, and this is true in every translation I've read so far, which I believe have been by different people. The sentences are elegant and beautiful if you look at them closely, and there's a lot of really excellent, sharp decision making and how she transitions from one sentence to the next, sort of the logic that she pursues in the narration. It's extremely confident, but it doesn't have the sort of austerity that is its own kind of demand for attention, right? Its own ostentation. It is instead, you're seeing a person take pleasure in the writing that they're doing, and sometimes that becomes a little more obvious in this book in particular, because we have a narrator who is not a writer but who is writing, and so occasionally indulges in some twists and turns that do draw attention to themselves, some leaps of logic that a more disciplined writer would not allow herself. But for the most part, you're in the world, you're experiencing what the characters are experiencing. There is that sense of transparency, of looking through the prose and into the world that is being described. Whoosh! Finally, I'm going to read you a selection from Isa's Ballad, also by Magda Szabó, as translated by George Sirtis. And I apologize for all of the Hungarian names and words that I'm mispronouncing. I'm sure it's most of them. I'm trying. I could probably have tried harder. But this is what I've got. This will be the last thing I read, and I probably won't really say anything about it afterward. The news arrived just as she was toasting bread. 3 years earlier, Isa had sent them a clever little machine that plugged into the wall and made the bread come out a pale pink. She'd turned the contraption this way and that, examined it for a while, then stowed it on the bottom shelf of the kitchen cupboard, never to use it again. She didn't trust machines, but then she didn't trust things as basic as electricity. If there was a prolonged power cut, or if lightning had disabled the circuit, she would take down the branched copper candelabrum from the top of the sideboard where the candles were always ready in case the lights went out, and would carry the delicate flame-tipped ornament through the kitchen and into the hall, raising it high above her head the way a tame old stag carries its tines. She couldn't even get used to the idea of an electric toaster. She would have missed crouching by the fire itself and the strange noise of the embers, so like the panting of a living being. The constantly changing color of the cinders lent the room a peculiar life. When the fire was lit, she didn't feel she was alone, not even when the house was empty. There she was now, squatting on the stool beside the open stove, and when Antal rang the bell, she suddenly didn't know what to do with the miniature toasting fork, so she took the thing with her, a piece of toast still stuck on the end of it. Antal stared at her at first, then took her arm, and the clumsy gesture told her what he didn't want to say. The old woman immediately welled up, but the tears refused to run and remained stubbornly balanced in the corners of her eyes. Her instinctive reaction was, however, governed by her more properly functioning good manners, which were a mixture of instinct and sound training. They even enabled her to force out a "thank you, dear." Of the two smaller rooms at her disposal, she only heeded the back one. When they entered it and the old woman had lowered herself to the stool again, Antal warmed his hands on the side of the stove. They didn't speak, but understood each other perfectly. "I need to gather my strength," said the old woman's thoughts. "I loved him very much." "Take your time, we're in no hurry," Antal replied silently. "In any case, there is no use you coming out. There's no one there now. At least you wouldn't know anyone who arrived after dawn. But I'll take you out there, because you have a right to see them too, those people you wouldn't know." When they finally set off, the old woman took along her string bag. She always took it to the clinic. It was what she carried Vince's stuff in, what he asked for or what she thought it good for him to have. Handkerchiefs, biscuits, the lemons he liked. The yellow globe shone jovially through the mesh of the bag. "She's trying to work magic," thought the doctor. "She wants to work magic with 3 miserable lemons. She thinks if she shows death she is not frightened of it, it will run away. She thinks if she turns up at the old man's bedside with lemons, she will find him still alive. There had been a light frost overnight, and the stairs were slippery because the old woman hadn't salted them since the previous evening. He took her arm and led her down. The door of the outhouse was open, with a layer of muddy snow on the threshold, and behind it, as if ensconced in a fortress, Captain was peeking out. You could tell by the way he was digging in the straw that he had messed up his bed again. The old woman looked away. Her arms stiffened and her breath came faster. She has noticed Captain, the doctor thought, but she's pretending not to have seen him. Captain is black. One is not supposed to see anything black on a day like this. Only white. Coleman, the shopkeeper, gazed after them from behind the glass door of the state grocer's as they closed the gate and set off toward the taxi rank. It has only just gone 7. It seems the old man is approaching the end. Shame, he was a quiet little thing, patient, always willing to let people, children or adults, go in front of him as he waited for his can of milk. The girls loved him because he'd always bring them flowers from his garden in the summer, and when it was winter, he'd bring them tea and bits of roast marrow. Well, poor old boy, time for him to go now. His daughter will have a good cry. She sent them money each month from Pesht, the postman told us. What was Antal thinking of, divorcing her like that? Though he's decent enough himself, and his patients speak well of him. The old woman, too, was thinking of Isa as they got into the taxi in front of the cake shop. Dad has cancer, Isa had said in a strangely cold voice some 3 months after she had unexpectedly rung from the capital to arrange an examination for him. Isa was scrubbing her hands in the bathroom with slow, deliberate movements the way doctors did, the way she got used to in medical school. The old woman herself sank down on the edge of the tub, grabbing at the bath tap because everything had gone dark, then sprang to her feet again and rushed into the hall because she had heard Vince's voice. "What are you doing hiding in there?" asked Vince in ill temper, but she just stared at him in repulsion and terror as one might look at an already decomposing body. She couldn't answer, couldn't think of anything to say. Isa saved her, having stepped out of the bathroom behind her, raising strong white fingers. "Not everyone is as dirty as you, old man," she said, and Vince's thin face began to glow. Old man was what Isa used to call him, a younger, loud, shiny-nosed Isa. "Other people wash their hands several times a day, like me," said the girl. "Now get back into the room before you catch a cold. If I had as little salt in my stomach as you do, I'd not be rushing around so much. I'd take some Pepsin." The old woman knew Vince suspected something. Ever since the uncontrollable agonizing pains began and he started losing weight, he had become suspicious and was constantly listening out in case he caught a snippet of some conversation that might tell him why he was growing ever weaker, something that might explain the burning pain that he felt ever more frequently. I couldn't possibly shout at him like that, the old woman thought, and even in her current state of distress was bursting with pride that Isa could. "Come along, Mama, let's go down to the Presso for a coffee. You coming too?" Vince smiled at that, proudly surveying his spindly legs. They must still look strong enough to make it down to the Presso. He wagged his head to say no, and Isa shrugged, saying she didn't care since he'd only be eyeing the women there. She grabbed her coat and gently bumped her forehead against his own beautifully shaped brow on her way out, as she had done since she was a child. "Now be sure not to cheat on Mama while we're out." Vince just kept wagging his head with a sly look on his face and his eyes that for weeks now had looked unfamiliar, so unfamiliar that she found herself gazing at them, puzzling why they should seem both smaller and, at the same time, wider and duller than before, suddenly flickered and came to life. His conversations with Isa always had an element of flirtation, not at all like the ones you usually hear between father and daughter. They were more like friends, or accomplices, heaven knows in what. Neither of them touched their coffees in the Presso, they just stared at them, turning the small glasses in their hands. Isa looked pale. "He has about 3 months," she said. "Antal will bring him medication. I'll leave you some money. Buy him anything he wants, however foolish. Don't spare the cash." Music was playing, and the old woman suddenly felt that she and Isa were like two executioners, planning something terrible right here, in the shade of the red curtain. Knowing that Vince would be gone in 3 months' time and being aware that she knew now that he would no longer be then had such a powerful effect on her that she imagined Vince as a prisoner, one of the condemned, and that she had just been informed of the moment of his execution. She did not dare ask if Decker's diagnosis was reliable. She knew from both Isa and Antal that Decker was never wrong. The music grew louder, lovers were gazing at each other, the waitress was asking if she would like some cream in her coffee. Isa answered for her, saying yes. The cream was stiff and too sweet. She dropped it while she was putting it in the coffee and scraped it off the table in confusion, feeling guilty. "Try to pull yourself together," said her daughter. "Let me tell you what you can expect." She had to force herself to listen at first, as she was again informed that Vince had at most 90 days to live, but suddenly she wasn't understanding anything, her tears blurring the great red curtain before her. "Listen," said Isa, "we have very little time and we have to discuss things." Isa always spoke in this serious, calm manner when there was something important to settle. She felt like screaming and knocking away the cream, but she didn't, of course. She hadn't the strength and wouldn't have dared in any case. It was just for a moment that she wanted to. An old woman does not indulge in hysterics or make scenes. She simply asked, "Are you coming home?" It was as much a plea as a question. Inside she was praying, beseeching God in inchoate, ungrammatical sentences, insisting that she should come home, that her daughter should be with them, and not leave her alone to cope with the dying. Isa was a doctor. Isa was her child and had always helped them through. The younger woman took a deep, violent gulp, as if the coffee she was raising to her lips at last were solid rather than liquid, and said, "I can't." She comprehended the thought behind it and supposed it to be right. If the girl took a vacation, that would mean only that she might visit a little more often than usual, and then Vince would guess something was up, would look for the reason and discover it, and that simply must not happen. Isa always came at the regular prearranged time, once a month, and on occasions like birthdays, name days, and wedding anniversaries. She couldn't come this time. Well, of course she couldn't. So the old woman would have to deal with Vince by herself, as well as with the terrible secret that Vince was going to die. Isa's promise that Antal would be with them to help was of little consolation. Antal was an Isa. Her tears began to flow, and she felt rather than saw that the people at the next table were watching her. Isa didn't try to calm her, but simply held her hand. She hung on to the girl's cold, ringless fingers. The taxi was taking them past bare plane trees down Sanders Street, where a huge billowing advertisement invited people to a night of dancing. Antal heard a great sigh and looked back from the front passenger seat. The old woman did not respond to his gaze, but coughed and turned aside, watching the street and the swirl of rooks past the wayside trees. Antal was good to her, just as he had been good to Vince, and once upon a time they had loved Antal very much, but Antal had left Isa, and that could be neither forgotten nor forgiven. The radiators down the corridor were pouring out heat. The air was dry and smelled of dishcloths. The porter opened the lift door for them, but even at this dreadful time she was cheered because the porter's smile seemed like a form of defense. She sat down in the small waiting room at the turn of the corridor, and while Antal went to fetch the professor, it was Decker's last year at the clinic, she took the handkerchiefs and lemons out of her string bag and put them back in again. She was terrified of the thought of talking things over with a stranger, but took strength in recalling that the meeting was not about her, but about Vince. The politeness with which she was greeted at the clinic was a mark of respect for Isa. She didn't really believe Antal when he said it was the end, but when Decker appeared in the corridor and walked toward her, the string bag in her hand felt much heavier. It was as if she were carrying lead rather than lemons. Decker was a professor, and she could tell by his face that her poor, tremulous questions would be answered directly. Later, Isa asked her what she and the professor had said to each other. She tried to put it together in her mind, but she couldn't. She could only remember Decker touching her on the shoulder because she had shaken off the well-intentioned fingers, as if a sudden fierce bitterness had taken possession of her, more an irritation, a deep antipathy. So she felt that Decker, who had spent 3 months moving heaven and earth to help Vince and would have given his soul to save him, was a murderer and, what was more, a murderer of the same age as her husband. What right had he to be so healthy? She stopped in the doorway. Antal said Vince had been unconscious since sunrise and would probably not recover consciousness but slip into death as he slept. Yes, but if she walked in, he might wake. It couldn't be that 49 years of physical and spiritual union should prove weaker than death. But what would happen if he should sense her closeness and start speaking in that gentle, childish voice of his and ask her to account for all that was happening, for his pain and for his ebbing life? What would happen if today, on this, his last day, he were suddenly to become aware of the threshold on which he was standing and burst into helpless tears again, sobbing as he did when he lost his job back in the 20s, when he stood beside her bed in his nightshirt, dropping tears, begging, "Help me, Eddie." What if he asked her to help him now when he already knew there was no hope, yet still begged for his life, for what was impossible. Vince loved life. Never mind being a pauper, unemployed, or sick, he still thought merely being alive, simply being on Earth, the fact that he could wake up in the morning and go to bed at night, that he could be in a place where the wind blew, where the sun shone, and where the rain pattered quietly or poured down was wonderful. She would have to lie to him as she had been lying continuously for months now. She was afraid that Vince would leave her without a word, that he might cast his terrified conscious eyes on her one last time, and after having dozed off with pain or with the assistance of drugs, his thoughts might turn to silent accusation or complaint. Until threw his coat on a chair as he entered. It was only now the old woman noticed he was not wearing a white surgical gown. He didn't look like a doctor without it, just a member of the family. Something he hadn't been for a good few years now. The first person she spotted in the room was Lydia. The nurse turned her away when the door opened and stood up from the chair by the bed, smoothing her apron. She didn't greet the old woman in words, just nodded, the only natural thing to do in these unnatural circumstances. She adjusted Vince's blanket a little, then went straight out, not even casting a glance back at the bed. How strange, the old woman thought. She has been at his bedside for weeks, and she leaves like that, her eyes quite dry, without any sense that she was part of this? Can people get used to death? Vince wasn't conscious, but he didn't look detached from the world either. More as though he were simply asleep, the skin on his brow tight and silvery. His nose had grown since yesterday, and there was no trace of the little red moon on its bridge where his glasses used to sit. She looked again and realized it was not a matter of his nose growing, but of his face falling back. He has left me, thought the old woman. He didn't wait for me. For 49 years I have known his every thought. Now I don't know what he has taken with him. He has left me behind. She sank down on the bed and gazed at him. She had been nursing him for months, day and night, to the point of exhaustion, but now she didn't feel the least bit tired and could start the whole process afresh. If only she could take him home, even as he was, in his sad open nightshirt from which his ribcage emerged higher up than she expected. Seeing what had become of his body, she might even be able to hold him in her lap. She should never have let him out of her sight. Isa meant well in bringing him out here, meant well for them both, but she still shouldn't have allowed it. Perhaps if it were she herself who had been beside him these last few weeks, he might have lived a little longer. But it was Lydia who had nursed him. Lydia who had changed his bed every day. Lydia who did everything. Lydia was precise, patient, and kind, but could she tease him and get some more food into him? Could she mock him the way Isa did, telling him there was nothing wrong with him, that he was simply old? Could Lydia hush his choked words of complaint? I shouldn't have let him enter the clinic, thought the old woman, because he has left me like this now, unaware of my presence, without a word of goodbye. She bent down and kissed him. Vince's brow was dry and smelled of medication. She sat down beside him and held his hand. About noon, Decker looked in and Lydia returned. Untal was no longer in the room. She hadn't even noticed him going. Decker was there only for a moment, and she thought Lydia had gone with him, but the girl hadn't moved. She was by the window, level with the bed, watching them from there. It bothered her having a strange pair of eyes on her, so she turned her back, but then, not seeing her anymore, she immediately forgot there was someone else there. By that time, only Vince's hair was still alive, a few stubborn locks of his white mane. She felt neither tired nor hungry and was unaware of the passage of time. She straightened her back. It hurt, having constantly to be leaning over. In the afternoon, Vince spoke. She thought her heart had stopped. It had been so silent till then, so infinitely silent it seemed she was surrounded by a solemn, impregnable wall of silence that would permit no voice. His body trembled as he spoke. Even his eyelashes trembled. She leaned to his mouth to catch whatever he was whispering. Lydia was there also listening, and on seeing the face of the younger woman beside her, she suddenly felt angry and downright hostile. She hated Lydia now, felt she was pushing in, that she was soulless. You see, Untal has gone and Decker too. They are sensitive people. What do you think you are gawping at? Are you deaf? Can't you hear the sick man is calling for water? Why don't you move? She just stands there, gawping at Vince without moving at all. She should be leaping up, getting a glass of water from the bedside table that had been totally cleared by someone. Vince's glasses were gone, as well as his cup and his little pencil stub, but somewhere inside she was rejoicing because the nurse didn't know what to do, and it was only she who could hear Vince's words, she who knew what he wanted, she who could get him something to drink. Even now, she could still do something for him. She poured water into the glass and raised Vince's head, putting the glass to his lips. The mouth wouldn't open, and a look of something like disgust, something distinctly unpleasant, flickered across his face. Vince did not drink. "He's not thirsty," whispered Lydia. "Don't try making him drink." She could have hit the nurse for saying that. Who was she to look down on her like some kind of god, to be giving her instructions and taking the glass from her hand? And in the meantime, that voice again, that strange horse breathing. "But why won't he drink if it's water he wants?" "I'm here," said Lydia aloud. At first she thought the nurse was addressing her, and that made her even angrier. But then she saw that Lydia was looking at Vince, not her, and that Vincent's mouth was trembling again in a way that reminded her of how he used to smile and how it lit up his face for a moment before immediately fading again. Lydia crouched down by the bed and held Vince's hand. The old woman felt she no longer existed, that she had been ignored, cut out, cheated. She glared at Lydia. Lydia was a complete stranger, someone she'd never met before, whose face was packed with a meaning she didn't recognize, and she felt a peculiarly fierce hatred for her. It was as if, for the first time in her life, her eyes had finally been opened and she could see. Thief! Cheat! She was stealing the last moments of her husband's life. It was Antal who had chosen this nurse. Antal had selected her to attend on the sick man. Isa wouldn't have done that. Now there she is, crouching by the bed, holding Vince's hand, a nobody. A stranger. "Go on, sleep," said Lydia. "I'm here." The old woman sank back onto the bed. She was so angry that she felt no pain at all. She snatched at Vince's other hand, the tender body lying held up by the pair of them. Vince didn't speak again. His breathing was barely audible. Lydia was still crouching beside him. Her face was no longer visible as she had bent her brow over Vince's hand. Outside, the March light had frozen between the trees. The old woman closed her eyes and stiffened at the waist. When she looked again, Lydia was standing. Vince lay precisely as before, but was quieter still. "He's gone," said Lydia. "It wasn't water he wanted. It was his daughter, Isa. I'll get Dr. Antal." And that's it. If you made it this far, thank you for listening. I haven't gotten that deep into this book, but I really love it so far. And I hope you enjoyed it. And I hope that next week I have a more traditional episode for you to enjoy. But I would also love to hear what you thought about this one. Bye.